Good afternoon, everyone. Do you love your neighbor? Who is your neighbor? When we were first married, we used to live in an apartment where every Thursday night, our neighbor would play loud techno music throughout the night. A neighbor down the hall would cook or burn random kinds of fish. Sometimes loving your neighbor can be a challenge. And yet it is how we are commanded to live. And how we live should start with the two great commandments, which are based on love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You can find that in Matthew chapter 22. And today we will touch on three ways found in Leviticus 19 to help us love our neighbor as ourselves. So I will assume that you understand the point that you should love yourself also. So for this message, the focus will be on our interaction with our neighbor. And essentially, our neighbor is everyone we interact with, and we will cover more on this later. So the first way that you can love your neighbor is to consider sharing your blessings with your neighbor. Consider sharing your blessings with your neighbor. And the Old Testament provides a lot of helpful information for how we should treat our neighbor. So let's turn to Leviticus chapter 19, and we'll start in verse 9. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 9. Here it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean," which means, gleaning means to gather the leftovers, like you're going over it another time. "And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God." So loving your neighbor starts with how we think about life and our fellow human beings, regardless of their social status. It is default human nature to look out for yourselves, what we have and how we can obtain more things. Maybe we store way too many belongings because we might use them one day. With a shift of perspective, we may realize that these belongings are things that someone may be able to use today. And it took thought and consideration to leave the corners of a field, or to not collect every single grape in your vineyard, or every piece of grain in your field. And as we look around and consider our blessings and what we have, maybe there is something we can share or give someone who might need it. The Thanksgiving holiday is one of the times during the year when we as a society put effort into collecting food for those who are poor and hungry. And it's a wonderful tradition and a blessing for those who need it. So let's consider our blessings and how we can share those blessings with other people. The second way is to consider your actions towards your neighbor. To consider your actions towards your neighbor. So even if we were to do an overwhelming number of great and wonderful things for the people around us, there are certain awful actions that can contradict those or cause hurt and pain that overshadow all of those good things. And we can see a list of these as we continue in verse 11. Let's continue in chapter 19, verse 11. Here it says, "You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. And you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." So when you look at these words here, they seem kind of similar or repetitive, but they are different Hebrew words. And as defined by Strong's, steal means to secretly carry something away, or implying deception. And deal falsely means to be untrue in word or in deed. So it's also deception and lying. And to lie means to cheat or be untrue with your words. And not swearing by God's name falsely. The word falsely is another word which means untruth, a sham, lying, or deception. So this section exalts us to be honest and true with one another, and to be truthful in the way you use God's name. So let's continue in verse 13. You shall not cheat, and cheat means to defraud or even oppress someone. So you shall not cheat or oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear your God. I am the Lord. So, for example, during this time of year, let's say you hired someone to rake your leaves, and you had the money with you, but you said, well, I can't pay you today. I'll pay you maybe tomorrow. And here it's saying, why can't you just give it to them now? Just having the money in your hand is not going to gain you more interest or more money just by holding on to it one more day. So it's sort of oppressive for that hired worker. Like maybe they were expecting that money, and that money was to buy food for their families or to provide in some way for their family. And with verse 14, what's the harm of cursing the deaf if they can't hear you anyway? Well, in both cases, cursing the deaf and causing the blind to stumble, they are malicious actions where the person can't really retaliate against you. So that is not the behavior God is looking for in us, and we should not be hurting people with our words, whether they can hear it or not. And we should look for ways to actually help remove obstacles for others, whether people can see or not. So these verses in Leviticus use two different words that are translated as neighbor as well. So one of the words Strong's defines as associate or brother or even companion, a friend, a lover, and a neighbor. The other word adds kindred man, fellow, or just another. So a neighbor is not only someone who lives close by, it includes anybody you come in contact with. And Jesus expounds on this neighbor principle with the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. But let's continue here in Leviticus in verse 15. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor. And the word honor here means favor. So you're not going to favor the person of the mighty, which could be just somebody that's rich or great or noble. So you're not going to be partial to the poor or favor the rich. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. So there are numerous verses that talk about partiality, and James states plainly that partiality is a sin and directly goes against showing love to your neighbor. If you want to hold your place in Leviticus 19, you can turn to James chapter 2 and verse 8. Or I can just read it for you here. James chapter 2 and verse 8. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. So how do you feel when your boss shows partiality to your coworker over you, or favoritism for other employees? Or as a sibling, when your parents show favoritism to your brother or your sister? It doesn't feel too great. It may cause actually a deep seed of resentment and hostility. Many times, partiality is shown unintentionally. So we should be aware of it in our words and our actions and be on guard against it. Let's continue, and also actually a reference to verse 16 mentions not going about as a talebearer, which Strong's defines as a scandal monger, which we don't use those words, talebearer or scandal monger, very often. So it's someone who travels around collecting secrets, slander, or scandalous behavior, and then tells everyone about them. So obviously most people do not like this sort of behavior if someone does it to you. And Adam Clark has an interesting comment on this. He says that talebearers are a more despicable character exists not. Such a person is a pest to society and should be exiled from the habitations of men. So he feels pretty strongly against talebearers. And then the second part about opposing the life, which that word is translated as blood. So you're opposing the blood of your neighbor. So it's literally the life on the line when you're standing against them. So when you oppose your neighbor that way, you're not obviously loving your neighbor when you're standing up against them and declaring that they should be dying. You're advocating for their death. So far, we have considered sharing your blessings with others, which was the first point. And here, through this section, we consider the actions we should take to be honest and true, and without oppression, partiality, and slander. So the third way is to consider the feelings in your heart towards your neighbor. Consider the feelings in your heart towards your neighbor. So let's continue in verse 17. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So we see here that we are not to hate in our heart, to take retaliation or hold a grudge if we love our neighbor. These thoughts that get played over in our minds and hearts can cause bitterness and anger. You know, if you start thinking, this person took this from me, so I will get them back one day. Or I'm not going to give them anything next time they ask. Or maybe we are just calling them names in our head. How can we show love and outgoing concern if these are the thoughts running through our hearts and our minds? It can be a difficult situation you find yourself in, and you would have a hard time rebuking, as it says here in this verse, which rebuking means to convince or to correct. So you'd have a hard time convincing or correcting your neighbor if they're sinning in love if you hold a grudge. And you can see Matthew 18, verse 15 on how to go through that process. And many people assume that the command, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is only found in the New Testament and is not specifically mentioned in the Old Testament, and yet here it is. Here you found it. Congratulations. And this is where it is referenced from the New Testament that the scribe and Jesus reference. So consider how your thoughts and feelings in your hearts should be centered on love and concern for other people. So today we covered 3 ways you can be actively practicing love for your neighbor, found in Leviticus chapter 19, where you consider sharing your blessings with your neighbor, how your actions can either promote or hinder love towards your neighbor, and by honestly examining the feelings within your heart and mind towards other people. And your neighbor is anybody you come in contact with, whether they live next to you or whether you interact with them on your travels. Take the time to consider the perfect love God and Jesus Christ have for each of you, and how you can use these 3 ways in your daily lives to love your neighbor as yourself.